This is Studio 809.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I'm your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media accounts, my columns at the Pikes Peak Bulletin, my photography website. We're going to get more into photography here in just a bit. You can also sign up for my newsletter. You can email me if you have suggestions or comments. And you can also sign up to become a patron of this podcast and support me. You can do that at patreon.com/hikingbob. And all that is right there. We'd love to hear from you, and we appreciate all the supporters at Patreon. Today, my guest is someone I met on my latest trip to Iceland with National Geographic. We had a great time talking there, and it was great to watch him and learn from him. His name is Jonathan Kingston. He is a National Geographic contributing photographer, which means he's an independent contractor, does a lot of work for National Geographic. Fascinating stories that he told us on the cruise. We had a great time, and if you haven't looked him up, look him up. His photography is outstanding. You don't get to be a National Geographic photographer when you're a hack like me. So Jonathan's stuff is awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know you're busy, probably in between travels right now, but thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure, Bob. Thanks for taking the time. Looking forward to the convo.
Yeah, it was great learning from you. You and I think, are about the same age, and I'm only judging that based on some of the stories you told and when they were taking place. We're pretty close in age. You started off, if I understand correctly, not so much getting into photography as much as getting into outdoor adventures. Is that a safe way to put that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was never great at anything in school, and when I discovered the outdoors, when I discovered specifically rock climbing, that changed my life. It changed sort of the course of my life, and it was the first thing that I could do when I was doing it, that it was the only thing I was doing in my head. You know, I had all these other distractions that were always coming in, and when I was on the rock, that was it. That was the epiphanous moment.
And if I remember correctly, you did some pretty well, what I consider pretty crazy, and I was a firefighter, but you did some stuff that I thought was pretty crazy. You climbed up, was it El Capitan in Yosemite with just free climbed it? Is that right?
Yeah. Free, and free climbing is obviously different than soloing. I was using ropes and all the safety equipment to get to the top, but that was sort of my life goal at the time, was to summit El Capitan before I turned 20. I wanted to summit it as a teenager, because this is, the mid 1990s. At that point in history, there had only been a handful of teenagers who had accomplished that task. Most of the older climbers were, in their 20s when they did it. So that was the overarching goal, and I managed to just barely pull it off. So that was a pretty incredible experience.
Awesome. You're from the West. You're living in Oregon. I believe you said are you from originally the West part of the United States?
I grew up in Virginia. I grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in a town called Blacksburg. If you know or heard of Virginia Tech, that's home to the Virginia Tech University. And then I moved west in my late teens.
Okay.
It always call. I mean, that's where the good climbing is. That's where the big cliffs are. So
did you move to the West because of the climbing, or just that happened to be just how it worked out?
No, that was definitely a huge factor in it. Like, I wanted to go where there's going to be great rock climbing, but the other factor was there was a wonderful photography school in Santa Barbara, California at the time. And that was something I discovered after I discovered climbing. And so those two things, the great climbing, the great opportunity to learn about photography, were the two things that convinced me that moving west was the way to go.
So you talked about, you went west to go to photography school. Did you develop an affinity for photography early on? Was it an offshoot of your climbing? Did you say, I want to document the climbing, or how did these things kind of merge? Because I know a lot of your stuff, the photography we saw when you did a presentation on the ship, was a lot of that was some pretty incredible rock climbing photography, and you showed us how that's done. And I'm not scared of heights, but some of that stuff had me kind of clinging to my seat a little bit. Did the photography come because that was just something you wanted to do anyway, or was it an offshoot of being interested in the rock climbing?
That's a great question. So I discovered rock climbing first. I think I discovered it when I was, gosh, maybe in middle school, 12 years old, something like that. There's a summer camp and they had a climbing program, and that light bulb came on. And then a few years later, when I was in high school, is when I discovered photography. And there's a great vocational program at the school. A great teacher named Mike Kaler was his name, and he introduced me to the darkroom. And it was the second thing in my life after climbing that it was that total focus. I could just instantly get into a sort of a flow state with it. Same thing with climbing. When I'm on the rock, I'm in a flow state. When I was in the darkroom, when I was behind a camera, I was in that same flow state. And so the two kind of married naturally. I wanted to document what I was doing on the rocks, but I also loved the technique and the technology of photography, and it just sort of became this wonderful little marriage that happened.
Were you thinking of doing your rock climbing as more of I don't know what career path it would be, but of a career path, or did you set out there like, obviously you made a big enough commitment, you were going to go to school to learn photography. Had you decided then that was where your career path was going to go, or was it still kind of like, let me just learn more about this and see what happens after that?
You know, I haven't thought about that for a long time, but if you'd asked 17-year-old me, what 17-year-old me would respond to that is, I'm going to be a professional rock climber and photography is going to be my backup plan. I really thought at one point in my life I would try to become, climbing was so early on in its infancy at that point as a sport. There were very few people that had forged a career path in climbing. Lynn Hill had done it, John Long had done it, but there weren't a ton of people who had made that successful. And what I quickly realized as I went into it 110% is I was just never going to be a good enough climber to reach that level, to become a professional climber, to sort of compete at that upper echelon. I was a good climber, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't, there's a difference between being in the top 5% and being in the top 0.5%. And I knew I was never going to reach that top 0.5%. And so at some point in my late teens, early 20s, that's when I really switched and said, okay, I think I can see a career arc in photography where I still get to do climbing, but this might be a little more sustainable long run.
Gotcha. Was it, we're talking about what I'm trying not to age anybody here, like the 80s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. What kind of time frame are we talking about for that?
Yeah, sort of. I'd say mid 90s is when I came to that conclusion. I started climbing in the late 80s.
Okay.
And then mid 90s was when I was really thinking, oh, maybe I can possibly pull this off professionally. And then by the late 90s, I'd realized I just wasn't going to get there.
And was there as much of an opportunity for like sponsorships and stuff then as there would be now? Like if you were trying to do this now or do rock climbing as a profession, would there be as much sponsorship then as there is now, or is there even that much now? I don't know. I'm not.
Well, no, I mean, definitely not. I mean, great question. Now that I'm kind of a little bit envious of the climbers that are coming through, because there's, social media opportunities. There's a ton of climbing companies out there. It's an Olympic sport. There's big money behind it. It plays really well on social media. So it gets eyeballs on it, which means that you can cross promote products when you do it. None of that was there in the 90s. There was Climbing Magazine, and it was a real niche sport. And if you told someone you were a rock climber, they'd do a double take and say, that's a sport? What are you talking about? So it's really evolved tremendously in the last 30 years or so.
Gotcha. So you decided that rock climbing and that kind of stuff wasn't going to be a good career path. I imagine you still do it. You still take time and do rock climbing. And you do any like hiking or through hiking? Have you done like any of the long trails, or how else is your outdoor recreation going?
Yeah, no, all of the above. I've never done any massive through hikes. A bucket list items, definitely the AT. That's going to happen. I've done large portions of it in Virginia and North Carolina. But, being outside is my happy place. So whatever form that takes, currently it's absolutely still rock climbing, but I've really gotten into river surfing in Bend, Oregon. There's an artificial surf wave in town, and spent 70 days last year surfing that wave, and mountain biking. I spent a lot of time on the trail, and then when the snows hit, I'm out snowboarding and just cross country skiing and just trying to spend as much time outdoors as I can. I mean, that's um, hell to me is being in front of a computer answering emails. Heaven to me is being outside doing anything.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
We're in complete agreement there. And I imagine Oregon has got to be a lot like being here in Colorado or being in Utah or Montana or Wyoming. If you're not in that um, outdoor recreation state of mind, that's you're in the wrong place, I guess would be the best way to put it. Like if you're out there, you have to be kind of an outdoor recreation kind of a person.
Yeah. No, it's my little slice of heaven out here. I mean, don't tell anyone else that. I know this is a podcast. Tell them to move to California or something, but it's wonderful.
We tell people the same thing about Colorado. You really don't want to come here. But, um, so you decided to go into photography. You went to school.
Hmm.
Um, how do you, and I know this is going to be like a loaded question, I guess, but how do you end up going from a kid in high school who decided I like photography? And let me start off with this question for you. Did you have an influence on photography when you were a kid? Did you have a relative who was a photographer and maybe I picked it up on from my dad, who was a hell of an artist. He can draw in paint. And I will tell you, I cannot draw a straight line with a sharp ruler and a thin pencil. I just
Hmm.
can't do it. But I developed this artistic eye from my dad. Um, did you have an influence like that to get into photography, or did just something that just came to you kind of naturally?
I think in the background, it was always there. We would go on these huge trips around the country. We'd rent an RV or we'd rent a van and drive around and take pictures. And when we get back from these trips as a family, we'd do a big slideshow. For the neighbors would come over, we'd barbecue, and um, I remember distinctively one day after we'd come back from a trip, we were doing that slideshow, and my mom put up a slide of just a piece of seaweed that she'd taken on a wet pavement up in Canada somewhere, and thinking to myself, wow, that's a really interesting shot. And that was kind of one of those moments where I realized photography doesn't have to be about something. It can just be art. It can just be a shape. It can just be a form. Um, and it's funny because down the road, this is many, many, many years. I mean, this is recently in the last decade. I've learned that my father, who's a world famous chemist, he's helped invent treatments for cancer. He was into photography as a kid. He built his own darkroom. He built his own enlarger. He developed his own film. And that's what got him into chemistry. And my mother, who's also a chemist, worked for years and years for Polaroid. She helped develop the magenta dye that's in Polaroids. I knew none of this when I was in high school. Who's a stupid high school kid? You're not going to ask your parents about their past. You're just in your own head and trying to figure out your own way. But it's really fascinating in hindsight for me thinking about how those two paths kind of converged in the career that I chose.
Okay. So you go to college. I
Hmm.
imagine that's I've never had any formal education in photography, so somehow I've managed to become passably good. I've learned a lot from watching people like yourself and photographers I hang out with here, and kind of looking at other people and see how they do things. You go to school, you learn photography. Um, where do you go from there? Did you decide you were going to I mean, a lot of people want to shoot weddings and portraits. Did you decided you want to do something like that, or and then maybe that morphed into where you're at now, or did you just decide I want to do the kind of Nat Geo kind of stuff, travel and things like that? How did that go after college?
Yeah, I think in the back of my head, so the school I went to was a commercial photography school. It was called Brooks Institute of Photography, and they drilled into you how to become a successful commercial photographer, just like you said, whether that was weddings, whether that was shooting products, automobiles, things like that. But they also had this really unique program in underwater photography where they'd teach you how to photograph underwater. They'd go out on a boat for 4 weeks at a time, and come back, and they had a developing lab on the boat. So you could, this was back in the film days, we'd go down for a dive, we'd come up and process the film immediately. It was almost the equivalent of shooting digital today. We'd see the results within an hour of surfacing. So we knew right away if we'd made a mistake, and the learning curve was quick and steep. But in the back of my head, to return to your initial question, I had always wanted to work for National Geographic, and I think it was because what I saw on those pages were things that really excited me. It was things that were outdoors, either climbing or some big trek through the jungle or archaeology or interesting cultures. And when I graduated from Brooks, the very first job offer I got was to go teach at a school in South India. A Brooks alum had founded a photography school in South India called Light and Life Academy. It's still there. It's, I think, the only photographic college in Southeast Asia. And I'd been a really good student. He came back. He was recruiting faculty to teach at the school, and none of the faculty at Brooks wanted to go teach there. They said, we've got this great job in Santa Barbara. It's, it's job security. It's a beautiful place to live. Why don't you recruit some graduating students? And I just happened to be one of the names that came up. So I went over to India and taught at the school. And during that time, in my off days, I bought a motorcycle. I'd just drive around the back roads of Tamil Nadu and in the Western Ghat Mountains and get into these little villages and get to know people and find out about festivals. And I began photographing those. And that was sort of what eventually got me into National Geographic. There were a bunch of other steps along the way, but having that body of work from these incredible cultural events that I got to be witness to helped lay the foundation for many years down the road, getting me through the door at Geographic, because those were some of the portfolio shots that I showed them many years later down the road.
It seems that being in an I'll say exotic place like that, you go there to help teach at this school, and then you end up in a place that obviously has a lot of other photographic subjects. And obviously, if you've seen Nat Geo, anybody's seen Nat Geo pictures, I think Nat Geo can make almost any place look beautiful. Not that they're not to begin with, but I mean, they just move it up a step. Really had to be, I mean, I imagine just a stroke of luck that you got invited to go there. And then
Yeah.
the topic matter and the kind of thing that they like. But you didn't just walk in the door at Nat Geo and said, "Hey, I take great pictures. I was just in India.
Right.
Give me an assignment." So what
Right.
happened in the intervening time? Did you keep traveling? You mentioned a little bit about underwater photography. Did you kind of branch into that a little bit? What happened in between those places? Those different stops along the way.
Yeah. So to answer that question, I got to back up a few years. So prior to going to photographic school, I mentioned my dad, who's this world famous organic chemist. And when I came home from high school and I said, "Dad, I want to be a photographer," he was not thrilled with that idea. I get it. He was worried that I was going to be able to put bread on the table. And I'm a dad now. I totally get that. I'm going to be worried for my daughter when she gets out into the world and she's ready to get into the workforce. And so it was one of the things that I felt really convicted. One of the few things in my life I've ever felt truly deeply convicted about. This is a calling for me to become a photographer. And so we sort of went back and forth, and he said, "Look, Jonathan, just go to university, get a degree in anything other than photography. I don't care what it is. And then if you still have this desire to be a photographer, you have my blessing." I said, "Dad, deal, let's do it." So that first school I went to, which was actually Virginia Tech, I met a guy named Matt Belay, who was my roommate freshman year. So let's fast forward now. I've gone to Brooks. I've been in India. I've come back to the United States, and I get a call from this guy, from Matt, and he says, "Hey, JK, I'm working on the island of Molokai, Hawaii. I'm working at a retreat center, and this retreat center is run by a couple of National Geographic photographers. Next week, the editor-in-chief is going to be here, and they're all getting together next week to just support the retreat center, paint the walls, clean the floors, make it look great for the next workshops that are coming through. There's an extra spot for you. We have a bed. Come and meet these guys." And I said, "Matt, that's great. I'd love to do that, but I'm completely broke right now. I don't have money to even afford the plane ticket. He said, man, JK, you've got to make this happen and figure out a way. So I called up United Air. I had a bunch of frequent flyer miles, and the guy laughs at me on the phone. He says, you can't book a last minute redemption to Hawaii. You got to do that 6 months in advance. And I said, look, please just, maybe there's a cancellation, something, please just see if you can do it. Put in my miles, see if you can do it. And he said, well, actually, if you can leave from LA tomorrow at 11 a.m., I can get you to Honolulu, and then you can figure out the rest of your way there. That's close enough to Molokai. So I said, book the ticket. I was stoked. So within a couple of days of this phone call from my freshman roommate many, many years ago, I'm suddenly on the island of Molokai, and there's all these National Geographic photographers who've all come together to help this retreat center out. And what happened, they would not give me the time of day. I showed up and just tried to help out and tried to talk about photography, and that was the last thing they wanted to do, talk about at that point. They were kind of, they're in the early stages of retirement, a lot of them at that point. They didn't want to think about it. They wanted to think about being in Molokai and think about the beautiful landscapes. But about halfway through that week, the internet went down. And I'm a pretty tech savvy guy, and I said, hey, I think I can fix this for you guys. So I went in and adjusted some of the Ethernet cables and some of the settings on the computer, and everything was back up. And Ricky Cook, who owns the center, said, hey, you're really good at this. What else are you good at? I said, well, I'm taught for 2 years in India. I have this training in photography. He said, really? Well, we teach a bunch of photo workshops here. Would you like to come teach with us? I said, Ricky, sign me up.
Yeah.
He said, well, one of the guys here is the editor in chief of National Geographic. Let me introduce you to him. And so all of a sudden now I'm included in the conversation. And as a result of that week, I was invited to go show my portfolio to Susan Smith, who at that point was the director of photography at National Geographic magazine. And that was the very first step. It didn't happen right away. It still took a couple more years, but that was the right turn in the road. That was the door that opened, and I planted my foot as firmly as I could and walked through that door. And that's what got me there.
Just, and I want to say this the right way. Obviously, you had to have the talent, or none of this happens. But the merging of the stroke of luck of things just clicking into place. Obviously, if all that stuff clicked into place and your photography wasn't any good, it wasn't going to happen. You obviously, I don't want to diminish. You had to have the talent to even have them recognize that you were somebody they wanted to work with. And obviously, I've seen your work. You obviously have it. You get into National Geographic. You get introduced to their editor-in-chief. How does one get an assignment? Do they just say, you want to go to Antarctica for 2 weeks, freeze your tail off, and take pictures, and hopefully they come out on film? Because, for those of us go back to the film days, film doesn't like cold weather a whole lot. It also doesn't like hot weather and humid weather. There's a lot of things film didn't like that we've gotten over with that. How did you end up with your first assignment? Was it something you told them you wanted to do? Did you pitch something to them? Or did they just say, if you could be on, like going to Hawaii, if you can be on a plane tomorrow to go to this place, wherever it is, this is your assignment? Or did you pitch something to them, say, hey, how about if I do something like this?
Yeah, so the very first assignment, I guess to actually basically pick up where I was in the story, I'd shown my portfolio. Susan Smith had given me feedback. She said, it looks good, but you need to become a better storyteller. So I want you to go out in the world and keep working. And so I kept in touch with her, and I didn't hear anything from them for a couple of years, but I kept sending in every now and then, every few months, I'd send a little portfolio of images to Susan. I think it was probably her assistant that looked at it. And about 2 years down the line, I was back working in Hawaii for Paul Chesley, who's another geographic guy. He worked for years for the Books Division. And I'd just broken the one and only camera that I had. And it was that night I got a call from DC, and they said, hey, we have an assignment for you.
Oh, no.
Can you be in Virginia in 2 weeks? Little did they know they'd just hired the first photographer that didn't have a working camera. But
oh, no.
So that very first assignment was just the result of keeping in touch with them and keeping them, as front of mind as I was able to do. And it was for Adventure Magazine. I don't know if anyone remembers Adventure Magazine, but back in the day, they had the main magazine, National Geographic. They had National Geographic Traveler and National Geographic Adventure. And that was an assignment shooting, photographing a group of Royal Marines that were training journalists to go into, Iraq and Afghanistan. This was right in the middle of the wars. Um, and so that was the first one. But the other ones come through the pipeline in different ways. There's no one way that I get an assignment. Sometimes I'll pitch an idea, and they'll say, "That's a great idea, but you're not the right photographer to do that," and they give the idea to someone else, and that's happened, and that's hurtful when it happens, but I get it. I get why they do it, because they
In my idea, and you give it to somebody else.
give it to someone else. But they have that 30,000 foot view. They have a stable of at least 250 gals and guys like me that all have their own skill set,
Sure.
and they say this is the right pick, and it goes both ways. People have pitched ideas to them, and they've said, "Hey, Jonathan's the right guy for this." So it goes both ways. I think right now, what I'm most interested in at this point in my career is really getting. I've really been turned on by underwater archaeology, maritime archaeology work, and so pursuing unique shipwrecks that are historic, that haven't been found, and those usually start out not as an assignment but as a grant. I'll approach the National Geographic Society, and with a bunch of other archaeological scientists. I'm not a scientist. I'm the documentarian side of it, and we'll write a grant together and pitch them the idea. And then if they say that's a good idea, that gives the magazine the first right of refusal on that story. So
Great. So I just want to circle back real quick to the assignment part of it, and then we'll get into the underwater archaeology, because obviously, having been on a number of National Geographic trips, a lot of that stuff, they do a lot of underwater stuff. When National Geographic has an idea or they have an article they want to do, or a feature they want to do, and they need a photographer, they're not just looking at who's next up on the list. They're looking at, from what you're saying, who's done this kind of stuff before. So if they're talking about one in Antarctica, they're going to not just look at who's on the list, but who's on the list that's gone to Antarctica, I imagine. Who's on the list that's gone to Africa on a safari, because that person, I guess once you've got the assignment, is the wrong time to be learning how to do that kind of photography.
Yeah, I think
fair assessment.
that's a fair assessment. So there, I think there's two distinct timelines in the history of National Geographic. So there's the golden age of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when they had 200 to 300 full-time staff photographers. And I know a fair number of those guys. And so the stories from those days are very different from the story of today of how assignments come through. So back in those days, it is almost what you were describing, where they have an idea, they're planning it out a couple years ahead of time, and they have this stable of staff photographers, and they say, "Oh, George is next up on the list, and he has some experience in this, and he can learn on his feet. We're going to send him to go cover India." That's definitely not how it happens today. I think many of the stories today are actually started independently. They're actually partially photographed independently ahead of time, and with a really strong idea and a really strong body of work, and something that's really salient to right now today. Why is it important now? Why is it important for National Geographic? And then that story is brought before the editors, and then they'll say, "Yeah, this is a great idea. We're going to provide some additional funding for you to finish this story up." So that's a lot of times how it happens today. There are still cold pitches that come in that end up in print. But I would, if I had to take an educated guess, I'd say the vast majority of the stories coming through the pipeline today have been started independently, and then brought in front of the editorial team with something to show.
So it's almost like you're out doing a photo assignment that you might like. You pitch it to Nat Geo, and they write a story based on your photography. Is that the right way to put it?
Well, so yeah, sort of. I would say, yeah, a hypothetical would be, I know of a shipwreck. I go out and I photograph with a team of archaeologists, and I don't actually finish the story, but I have a good portion of it done. I show them the work and they say, this is really interesting. We're going to provide additional funding. We're going to send you back out in the field. We're going to assign a writer and we're going to finish that story up.
So you went from climbing high peaks on cliff sides with, free climbing, which you told me is different than solo climbing, which is without ropes, which I
Right.
can't even imagine doing stuff like that, to now going the other way into the depths. You grew up in Virginia. You ended up in the West, which I guess California, close enough, but that's a big leap to do that. How did you get attracted to going underwater? And at the days you're talking about, it was film cameras with these big plastic Icolite boxes you put your cameras in. And for anybody who's ever looked at underwater housings for cameras, they're custom made to the camera and they cost twice as much as the camera. And when you get a new camera, you got to get a new box for outrageously expensive stuff. How did you transition into doing the underwater stuff? Were you naturally attracted to the water besides also the mountains and the forest and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. When I moved to photo school, when I moved to Santa Barbara, I took up surfing immediately, and that got me in the ocean, and I fell head over heels in love with the ocean. I'd never been that close to it before, and knowing that I could get involved possibly in this underwater photography program that the school had, I took some independent dive lessons. I got certified, and I said, "Wow, this is just like climbing. This is when I'm doing this, all the other noises are gone. I'm hyper focused. I'm in this flow state underwater. I'm in this incredible world." And that's what turned me onto it. It was that third thing I'd found in life that just instantly got me into a flow state. Again, it became that marriage of, okay, well, how can I integrate photography into this new passion that I found, into being in this underwater world?
And I imagine that's a smaller, when it comes time to looking for photographers for that pool of photographers who does that underwater stuff has got to be a much smaller pool than those of us, like, here in Colorado. Everybody and their uncle is a landscape photographer, and 90% of them are really good. It's a bigger pool of people. Imagine when you get to underwater, and not only the technical part, we talked about the camera equipment and what you have to have, but just the ability to do that. It's got to be a big plus on your side. You know how to do that stuff. You do it great. And so now you become, I want to say, probably one of the go-to guys when somebody's looking for somebody to A, go underwater, and B, look for a shipwreck. You really worked into a pretty good niche for yourself to be able to do that.
If you'd asked me, again, if you'd asked 17-year-old me, in your photography career, what do you think you'll be doing? I would have said I'd be mainly shooting rock climbing, or I'd be shooting, like you said, landscapes or outdoor. I fell completely backwards into this maritime archaeology gig, and it is just so cool. And honestly, besides being underwater, besides all that flow state and everything I talked about, it's the guys that I get to work with. It's really fascinating people with fascinating lives, and they're all good buddies now. And that's the best part of it. I look forward to these sort of reunions, getting the gang back together when we go on these projects, and getting to look for 500-year-old shipwrecks.
That's awesome. So you've been to a bunch of places. Would it be safe to guess you've probably touched every continent?
Everything but Antarctica, and that's coming up in about 8 months or so.
Is that a Nat Geo like a tour like I was on with you, or is that a separate
Yes.
kind of a tour?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's on the tours that they run down to Antarctica on the Nat Geo ships.
Okay.
And that's been, those ship trips are just a great. I mean, you've been on them, you know how cool they are, and it's just such a cool thing that I'm able to plug into that kind of in parallel with assignment work.
Hopefully you're on the Resolution, which is the new ship they've got down there, all new and modern and stuff. It looks like a pretty cool ship. I have not seen that one yet, but I know it's their new ship. They use it for the Antarctic trips. When you go on these trips like you did with my group, and we've had Nat Geo photography. That was my 5th trip on a Nat Geo ship. Always have a Nat Geo photographer of some type on board. Do you find it's almost like and I want to be careful with this, almost like too easy for you because it's not like a big dangerous assignment or anything. You just kind of you're hanging out with the guests and the crew, and you're taking pictures as you go along. I don't want to say too easy. That brings it down a little bit less. Do you find it as be a super easy, or is it challenging in a different way when you're just mixing in with the tourists and the guests and just taking pictures next to you? And I were standing next to each other taking pictures, and then you're talking to some other people and showing them how to take pictures with their cell phones and stuff like that. How does that work with? How is the challenge different than other stuff you've done?
I've had to develop a different skill set for it. It's social photography, just like you described. There's other people there with me. I might be taking a picture, and they might have a shot about either how I'm composing or how they can do better with their cameras. And I'm more than happy to help them with that in the field. And I think what the skill set I've had to develop is, when I'm on assignment, I generally have a lot of time to really think about one shot. I mean, the longest it's taken me to get one single shot is 2 years. And that was a shot of a swimming elephant in the Andaman Islands. And most of that was planning. Most of that was planning.
People that when they complain about how long it takes me to take a picture, I don't take
So with on these trips, on the trips with Nat Geo, it's the skill set is, okay, I don't have 2 years. I might have 2 minutes now to take a shot. So it's made me be much quicker in how I'm seeing things. I react, I think, almost on a different level. It's almost a subconscious level a lot of times. Hey, something turned my head. I'm going to take a quick shot of that or a couple shots of that. And it's really doesn't cease to surprise me how often when I really trust that gut reaction, that subconscious reaction to something that turned my head, it actually turns out to be a pretty good picture. It can be a really compelling scene, whether that's a landscape or it's something culturally that's happening in front of me. And so in a lot of ways, I'm really grateful for that because it's helped me to shoot much faster than I ever did, out in the field.
Sometimes it's good to get out of your own space. And I know for me, shooting landscapes, I'm shooting something that's not moving. I have time to set up, wait for the light to get right, take some pictures, and then I go like on a cruise and we're shooting birds or wildlife, and I'm sitting there completely redoing all the settings on my camera because that's not what I normally use. I don't normally use servo focus and follow focus and motor drive, shooting and stuff like that, and getting into a different headspace. So you've gone from being more of a documentarian photographer when you're on these trips to more like a news photographer or a street photographer, going completely into more reactionary mode, I imagine.
Absolutely. You nailed it on the head. It really is almost a street photography level. And one of the best things that ever happened to me, a good friend of mine had gotten a new camera. It was the same camera as mine. And they said, hey, can you go through the entire user manual with this camera and help me learn all the settings? I just knew the settings that I knew at that point that worked for me. And then when I went through that whole manual, it was a light bulb. Wow, there's all these amazing autofocus settings and all these other things I can do, highlight priority metering. And that all works into this kind of new style of shooting that I've had to adopt on these trips. It's not that I'm not thinking in these situations. I've just done the thinking ahead of time. I know, okay, I'm going to be out doing street photography. This is all my settings. They're pre-set up on the camera before I even hit that situation. Oh, we're doing birds today. Okay, these are my bird settings. And so I'm turning my brain off so I can just see and look at what's happening in front of me. The thinking's done ahead of time.
Gotcha. As you've moved from as we've moved from the film era to the digital era, were you a pretty early adopter? Was Nat Geo a pretty early adopter of digital? Did they jump on it, or there was some people who are still film, and some people like me. Once Canon came out with and I'm a Canon shooter, the 10D, their first popular digital SLR, a whole 6.3 megapixels, which, by the way, the pictures still look great. And now we moved up. Did you and Nat Geo move to digital pretty quickly? And second question, to that second half of that question, with the early digital not being nearly as fine as it is today, was digital a backup to film, or were you shooting both, or did you just go right into digital?
So specifically on the Nat Geo side, I think the first digital cover image that they printed. I can see the picture in my head. It was a picture of a F-16 in flight, or maybe a F-22 in flight, and that was in the early 2000s. It was somewhere between 2002 and 2005, and that's right about when I switched. I switched from film to digital in. I remember it distinctly because it was right before an assignment. It was in the summer of 2004, and my digital camera was a Kodak DSLR-N. So it took Nikon lenses. The top usable ISO was about 400. I mean, it got really grainy at 400. It was much better at 100. Shot 2 frames a second, but it was a 15 megapixel camera, full frame, and that's what I was waiting for. I was waiting for a full frame Nikon option to come because I didn't want to have a crop factor. I wanted my lenses to act like the lenses that I knew. And I didn't look back. It was a cold hard switch for me. I went one day I was shooting film, shot my last roll. The next day I transitioned into digital. So
yeah, mine was pretty much similar. My wife and I were in Monument Valley on the Utah-Arizona border, and I'm shooting film, and the Canon 10D had just come out, and I have 2 cameras set up and loaded with Kodachrome film. And we're taking pictures, and my wife is like, "How do you know these are coming out?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm at least that good that we're going to get something out of them." But she goes, "Well, you have to take the film, and you have to mail it to get it developed, and they're going to mail it home, and we're not going to be home for another week, and you hope it gets there." I go, yeah. She goes, "You should probably get that new digital camera that just came out." I don't think people realize the cost savings. I looked at how much film I would buy, and I was shooting slides, so there wasn't the printing costs involved, and then it was the shipping of it back and forth and the cost of the film and the processing and mailing it back and forth, because Kodachrome can only be developed at that time. You can't even get it done anymore. So many places because it was a very complicated process. Part of it was a cost savings. That I paid a lot of money for the camera, but long term, and I've been there ever since. I'm kind of like you. I didn't look back. It was like there's a certain thing to be said about instant gratification, but there's also a certain thing to be said about instantly knowing you either got it or you didn't. And before you leave, make sure you got the picture. But of course, you want to get right the first time. But pretty big move. So were you always a Nikon guy? It sounded like you were always a Nikon guy. I've always been a Canon guy only because that's the first camera I bought and I stayed with it. But you always been a Nikon guy?
Well, yeah. So my very very first camera was actually a Minolta. But when I started shooting professionally, I switched to Nikon. And the reason I did that was, and that was when I made that switch was at photo school. And at that point, I think it was either 99 or 2000, trying to think what year it was. Anyways, the year's inconsequential. Nikon had come out with the D1X, or the 1DX, or whatever the name of it was at the time. And they were, at that point, it seemed like years ahead of Canon, years ahead of the other camera pipeline. So I said, okay, Nikon seems like it's ahead of it. They've got great glass. I like the ergonomics of it. I made the switch, and I've stuck with them ever since, for the same reasons. I'm so familiar with it. It's like an extension of my hand at this point. I know where everything is. It feels good. I know exactly what the lenses are going to do. So it's a comfort thing at this point. There's probably better systems out there, maybe, I don't know, but I'm happy with what I have. But yeah, to your point on film and the cost of it, my film career professionally was not long. It was maybe 3 years long that I was shooting film professionally before I switched.
Gotcha.
And I spent easily $30,000 on film and processing in that time. So, it was an enormous expense, just the processing costs and the cost of the silver halide. So,
well, I'm gonna show you back here, but those filing cabinets back there are basically full of slides, pages and pages of slides. 2 filing cabinets behind me. So I was in it a long time, and just a storage space back there. Where now I have a couple of hard drives sitting here that have, 15, 20 years worth of digital images on them. The cost of filing cabinets alone was pretty expensive. It's interesting how the camera thing kind of moved along. Minolta invented the autofocus lenses with the Maxims, and then that was still film. They eventually got bought out by Sony. And then Sony jumped way ahead of everybody with the latest mirrorless cameras.
Yeah.
And everybody was jumping ship and going to Sony. And I don't blame anybody for doing that. You get what's best for you. But I've always been the opinion, if you just hang on a little bit, they're all going to catch up. And now, of course, Canon has really caught up with Sony in the mirrorless area. I think Nikon has got some great cameras in the mirrorless thing. I've always been, this is what I got. I can pick up any Canon camera, turn on the menu, know where to find any setting, and go from there. And I don't have to relearn. I look at Nikon settings and I'm like, I have no idea where anything is. And if I gave you my Canon, you'd be the same way. Like, I don't know where this stuff is. So I've always been that way. But my first camera could have easily been a Nikon. Or it could have been something else, and that's what I would have stuck with. It's not that I necessarily am beholden to anybody. It's just like the first one I got, and I know how to use it, so I'm just going to stay with the system that I have.
Well, and one of the really interesting things, Dr. Bruce Bayer at Kodak invented the Bayer sensor in 1976. It's been around a long time, and when you mentioned Sony, what they did that was brilliant is they bought all of Kodak's patents, and that's when they made that giant leap. Kodak had a bunch of stuff in the pipeline they were just sitting on. Who knows why they didn't develop it, but now Sony has it, and they made that huge leap and all that technology. So
right.
And one more thought on the geographic side. Back in that heyday, these older guys that I know that were shooting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and your point about not seeing the pictures, not seeing it right away. They were essentially shooting digital, even though they were shooting film. So they'd be sent out in the field with thousands of rolls of film. They'd FedEx them back to headquarters in DC. They'd get developed, and then they'd come back for film review. So they would see throughout the process of their assignments, fairly consistently, not instantly, but within a month or so of shooting something, whether it was working, whether they needed to go back. So they were getting in that instant feedback loop that now we get digitally, which is so amazing to know right away. If we have it, we can walk away and photograph something else.
But they were also be able to do that because of the resources that Nat Geo had to pay for FedExing it back and having their own lab and FedEx. And then if they had to do it again, they had those tremendous resources that you and I, if you're not working for Nat Geo, don't have. So obviously having that instant feedback. I remember starting off with a cheap point and shoot 1 megapixel digital that I would actually use to proof what I was doing on film. And I think a lot of photographers early on were doing that.
Sure.
They'd buy a cheap one with their much higher resolution film at the time and better lens and just say, well, here are the settings I'm using. Let me take the picture. Let me check the composition. All right, I have it now. I'll shoot the picture on film. Kind of a two-step process to get to where we are now. So I think now we're really at a place. Speaking of digital, I just want to touch on one more thing about the photography part of things. When I take a picture, I'm a landscape photographer. I'm after art. So I'm kind of like, if anybody asks, do you manipulate your pictures? Of course I do. And every photographer, I think, does. We have these tools. The issue is how much. I did a whole podcast about artificial intelligence and phony photography, if for lack of a better word. When you're shooting for Nat Geo, they have much more specific or restrictive rules as to what you're allowed to do, or maybe not even you, what the editor's allowed to do. I guess you send them to an editor and they figure out what they're going to do with those pictures. Can you kind of go over what their restrictions are, how much they can manipulate or not manipulate a picture?
Yeah. So as far as what I'm doing, when I send in pictures, I have to send them the raw. I can send them a matched JPEG of how I think that raw file should be interpreted, but they're ultimately going to make that call on where the color balance is, where the white balance is, if any dodging and burning is going to take place. And the vast majority of stuff you see published in Geographic is they took the raw file, they did a color conversion, maybe some very simple dodging and burning, and that's it, done. You will see some pictures in Geographic that are photomosaics, or there's some wonderful day to night stuff that they're doing where one of their photographers sets up a tripod and takes 300 shots throughout the course of a day and then stitches them all together. And when something like that happens, that's disclosed in the caption. They say this was taken with this number of photos. This is how it was, this was stitched together. And so it's all, nothing's being hidden. They're not trying to deceive anybody. And they're never taking anything out of the frame that wasn't there, or putting anything into the frame that wasn't there. That's an absolute no-no. They're pursuing that journalistic excellence.
I imagine if you're doing something like out here you're in the West, I'm in the West, it's very dark. I just did an article that should be coming out this week in the paper about night skies and night sky photography. Some of that stuff, I imagine if you're out shooting Milky Way pictures, that was almost impossible to do in the film days.
Right.
If you couldn't expose film long enough and you could
Reciprocity failure, all that stuff.
and then
Yeah.
you had to have a motor drive to keep the thing lined up with the Milky Way. Now it's easy to shoot, but it requires a fair amount of manipulation. So I imagine if you're doing, you can shoot it and you can kind of see it on the raw, but without I tell people shooting the Milky Way is easy. Making a picture out of it it takes almost three times longer, a lot longer. Last one I think took me 20 minutes just to get it to where I liked it. I imagine something like that though. If Nat Geo is taking Milky Way pictures or Aurora Borealis pictures, which is the same way. You can't really see them with the naked eye. The camera sees them. I bet something like that has to be manipulated to bring it out. And again, that would be something that would be disclosed.
Yeah.
We edited this picture to bring it up or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. And I've never published any of the Milky Way shots. I know exactly what you're talking about. You really have to, bring up the clarity and maybe drop a mask in there to sort of bring the lightness up in the Milky Way. You should get in touch with a guy named Babak Tafrishi. That is his jam. That's all he does for Nat Geo is night sky photography. And it'd be interesting actually to look up some of his work. You could probably just do a quick Google search and see how they've disclosed his process with that. So
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, I've taken up a lot of your time. This has been a great conversation, much like the conversations we had on the ship. And I know you and I kind of emailed back and forth. I got off the ship, and then another group of people was getting on the last day that we were on that ship. And I've told the story on a previous podcast. The weather was horrific. The boat was moving, I think, in three different directions at the same time. I'm not sure how that's physically possible, but I swear at one point the bow was down, the stern, the port was. I mean, it was just we were moving around. It was a rough night. They were handing out Dramamine like nobody's business. We had great weather on our trip, the trip that you and I were on. We got to go to the Arctic Circle. And I'm guessing what you told me was the group that left the day that we departed ship, the group that got on and started their voyage, had an entirely different experience. I guess it was rough, and you guys had not so great weather. We got lucky, I guess.
You hit the magic window, my friend. Yeah, it was 12-foot seas for about 5 days, and snow came. It actually photographically it was pretty interesting because snow came in on a lot of the high peaks, so the landscapes were a different look than what we saw on our trip. They kind of had that dusting on top and then nothing down at the bottom. But yeah, we got beat up for a few days for sure.
Ouch. Well, I know the people in Nat Geo, they're good at punting and adjusting and adapting and overcoming. So I'm sure they made it an enjoyable trip for them just as much as we had a great trip. Like I said, we got just the luck of the draw. That's the week I picked, and boom, I got great weather. One last question I have for you: if somebody is starting out in photography, somebody's listening to this, and being a Nat Geo photographer is what they want to do, or my standard is I'd love to get something in Arizona highways because their photography, I think, for on land is some of the best photography I've ever seen. And I spend a lot of time there. And one day I'd like to get in there. What one piece of advice, if you want to have a picture in Nat Geo someday, do something like what you're doing, what one piece of advice would you give somebody?
I would say it's not about the photography, it's about the story and it's about the science. I think a lot of the guys that are shooting from today, and again, I sort of came into it backwards. I thought you had to be this photographer with all these qualifications to work for them. A lot of the guys that are working from today are scientists. They're a world-class entomologist, and then they got into photography tangentially to document their work, and now they're telling great stories about entomology because they understand the science behind it. So I would say my piece of advice is find something that you're really curious about. At its core, Nat Geo is a scientific publication. So that kind of is under that umbrella. Deep dive in it, and then find a way to tell that story with photography, but that has that strong science component. So if you're interested in biology, study biology, master biology, and then find a way to tell the story of your understanding of biology with the lens. If you like marine mammals, go become a marine mammal expert, and then integrate the photography with that.
I'm thinking of the project Joe Sartori is working at with National Geographic, photographing virtually every species of, I think it's bird that he can find on the face of the earth. And he's talk about a project, and he's been working on this for years. And I follow him on Instagram, and another picture will show up, and like he photographed this other animal, and probably 5 people in the world have seen it, and he's one of them, and he had a camera and he got great pictures of it. I guess it's kind of the same thing. If you find something scientifically that they like and you happen to be a good photographer, that might be the path to get into. So not focus on the photography part as much as the science part of it, I guess.
Obviously you have to be a competent photographer and for Nat Geo a competent storyteller, but it really is that hook. It's that science hook that makes it relevant to today and makes it relevant to Nat Geo.
Do you often write the copy that goes along with your photos, or do they still bring in somebody to write the story to go with them?
So I'll suggest, I've written exactly one story for Nat Geo, and it was the most stressful experience of my life that I hope to never have to repeat because of the deadline and the word count and all those things. I love taking pictures. So no, they'll generally bring in either a staff writer or a freelance writer to write the copy of the stories.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time. I think we've gone a little over what I promised you, but I'm so glad that you were able to spend the time with us. I hope our paths cross again on another expedition with Nat Geo. I don't have anything that I'm looking at yet, but they send me emails and things in the mail all the time and say, go on this trip. And I'm like, someday. I would love to do one of their private jet trips, but they're like $100,000 to go around the world.
Well, that's my next assignment. I'm going to be doing private jet here in September. So they're God. Great. They're great trips. They're great trips.
I wish I had the money to be able to do one of those.
Yeah. No, I highly recommend them. Well, hey, I have a quote I want to read you from one of my mentors, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So there, a great friend of mine who was one of my mentors at photo school has these words. He says, "There's a mistaken belief some rather mysterious skill is necessary to become a good photographer, whereas the only real requirement is the ability to see clearly and objectively. Plus, of course, having the urge to take photographs." And I think that sums it up.
Absolutely. The eye and having not just wanting to pass it by, but grab it while you can. Absolutely. Jonathan, if people want to look you up, and I highly recommend they do, how can they find you on the web or on social media? How can people find you and see your work?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, probably Instagram's the easiest place to find me. It's just my name, Jonathan Kingston, JonathanKingston. And then I have JonathanKingston.com is another great place to find me. That'll link out to my blog and my stock website and all that stuff. So.
Well, Jonathan, thanks again. It's been tremendous fun having you on here and tremendous fun chatting with you on the ship and getting to meet you and getting to know you a little bit. I do really hope we get to cross paths again. If you're ever here in Colorado, by all means, let me know. And hopefully, if nothing else, we get a cup of coffee together and chat for a little bit. It'd be wonderful to see you again. And everyone listening, check out Jonathan's photography. It is outstanding. Nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.